Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint the Jade Falcon guards using a few tricks for fades that don't involve an airbrush. There's a few recent artwork examples to draw from in the Battle of Tukeyed and Battletech Legends books, but I'll be using the artwork from Aiden Pride's Alpha Strike card as my guide. You also probably noticed in the title that this is part 1 of a 2-part lesson. The reason for that is that this video is to help beginners see a 2-tone camo process and build up depth and shadow. The second part, for more experienced painters, will cover how to begin using oil paints and highlights and weathering techniques. Here's what I used for paints and brushes: a Rust-Oleum 2X flat red primer, Army Painter Army Green primer, more on that later, Citadel Militarum Green contrast paint, and Vallejo Model Color Khaki. For brushes, I have a synthetic No. 3 for washes, and a round eye makeup brush for dry brushing. You'll also want some plastic wrap or other painter's tape to help with some masking while priming. For model preparation, I've already sprayed an even coat of the flat red primer over the entire model and let it dry. Now I've taken some plastic wrap and masked around the lower half of the mech so I can begin to spray the Army Painter Green. Using short, light passes, I'm being careful to not let the coat get thick, and I'm angling the miniature so that I can get the red covered with the green on the upper half of the mini. I like the 2X flat primer and find it works better for me than the Army Painter primers. If I hadn't just had this can sitting on the shelf, I wouldn't have used it, because I find they seem to have more of a susceptibility to having issues with getting a grainy, flash drying on the surface. Rust-Oleum also makes some camouflage flat colors that I would have preferred to use, and they have an Army Green that I think would have worked really well for this. I did end up getting a few rough spots from the Army Painter primer, so sure enough, my concerns were valid. Of course, you can prime your mini in one color and then brush on 2 colors and blend in the middle with some dry brushing or blending, but this is a huge time saver for folks wanting to do a lot of painting that don't have an airbrush. Check for any missed areas and then let the paint dry per the instructions on the can. Once safe to do so, I remove the plastic wrap, and now I hold the miniature away from myself such that it allows me to spray the underside at about a 45-degree angle. I'm using short bursts, and I'm concentrating on aiming the paint just above the area where the colors meet, so that some of the overspray blurs the line between the red and the green. Now I've switched back to the flat red to clean up the lower half and avoid the transition areas. Starting low or even below the feet, I'm gradually and carefully working short passes along the lowest areas, working at a shallow angle to prevent getting red where I don't want it. I went back and grabbed the green again to remove any last bit of oversprayed red by repeating the same process I just completed with the red, but from the top side instead. Don't worry if you get a touch of color in an area you don't want, just try for even, smooth coverage as best you can. Let that dry completely per the instructions on the can before moving on. You can see we have our green top and red-brown bottom halves established and ready for a wash. I'm using Militarum Green contrast paint, so I have an agitator in the bottle and mix it thoroughly before I use it. Straight from the bottle, I'm applying it with my synthetic wash brush. I'm trying for complete, smooth coverage in all the most visible areas on the top, and then moving the paint around from areas where it was pooling into the others. I'm going to show as much of this process as possible, since I've had feedback from others that have had sometimes issues with contrast paints not seeming to get the same results as it did for me. You can already see how much of the hue of the light green is being changed by the contrast paint. A traditional wash will most likely not have as much of an impact due to the differences between the 2 types of medium. I'm using the contrast paint because I want the sharper contrast in the recesses, as well as the strength of the pigment to interact with not only the green, but also the red-brown. You can of course use whichever you're most comfortable with, or what you have available to you in your area. You can even use a green wash on the top and a brown one on the bottom if that's what you prefer. Once the green interacts with the red, I'm going to have a nice faded brown and a dark green in the recesses that will look better than you would have guessed by looking at the miniature while it's being applied. Because I've had that previously mentioned feedback about contrast paints not always working out well for some people using it, I'm going to let you watch me apply the contrast for several minutes before I continue on with a few more tips toward the end of the application so you can see the process I use in real time. Once the model is covered, now I'm going after heavy pooling and buildups so that I don't get any odd looking dark or stained areas. Gravity and capillary action will pull paint downward, so keep a lookout on lower surfaces like the ankles, knees, and lower legs for any excess paint or wash. Some of the contrast has partially dried while I've been applying, and I'm not happy with the results on a few of the areas on the top of the mech. I'll take my brush and try to move it around with just a damp bit of moisture on the brush, and if that doesn't work, I'll open up my contrast paint and put a little bit on my brush to use to reactivate the medium on the surfaces that need cleanup. Large flat surfaces are likely spots where you're going to need adjustments, but take a few minutes to let the paint settle and look over the whole model before you decide if it's done, and then set it down to let it dry. I'll let this dry for at least an hour. Here's the defined green and earthy brown that resulted from the contrast paint interacting with the base colors. It's time to start dry brushing. I'm using Vallejo khaki for the entire model, but a very light sea green for the top half would also yield a good looking result. I've got a round eye makeup brush and paper towel to help me pull the majority of the pigment from the bristles. I'm aggressively swiping my brush onto the paper towel to remove the potential trapped wet paint in the center of the brush. I don't want to end up with streaks of khaki while I'm brushing the edges of the model. I'm using light, predominantly downward and perpendicular strokes to highlight the top, sides, and edges of the areas on the legs. I'm really trying to get a muted, dusty look to help match the artwork, but take it as little or as far as you'd like on your own. I tend to pick out the areas I want to have the most highlighted first and do those as they're what I want to focus on bringing out on the model. This means that when I've gone over the entirety of the miniature, I can then go back and see how it looks and reinforce those initial areas, or bring up other areas as compared to others. If you like the brown and green tones you've already achieved and just want to bring out a little bit of the edges, then a very light touch and amount of paint on your brush will let you pick out the raised edges gradually without putting much pigment on the flat areas. It's also a great way to pre-edge highlight if you want to edge highlight with your brush or work on glaze highlighting areas. I'm working more paint onto the flat areas to add a worn, desaturated color to aid in the application of some oil paints later. If I weren't planning on taking things further along, I wouldn't be as liberal with the repeated buildup of paint on several areas. Once the model is highlighted to the level that you're happy with, you can move on to adding a few details like metallics or black joints, jump jet exhausts, weapon barrels, canopies, missiles, and decals. Part 2 of this paint process will show some weathering techniques as well, so I just suggest that even if you aren't interested in learning about oil paints, there will be some useful methods and that might appeal to you. Once again, I'll let the rest of the dry brush paint application continue for a few minutes, and then show you the intermediate result that's been achieved at the end. Here's how I finished up with the dry brushing step. You can see this is a nice foundation for both beginners to add a few finishing touches and get it on the table, or for painters looking to further work on adding advanced details. That's all from me for this first part, and I'll see you for the second. Take us out, Tex.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Shutdown sequence initiated.